Hey everybody, welcome back to our second part of our deep study into the Gospel according to Luke. Last week we gave an overview. We talked about some context, historical backgrounds that were happening in the book of Luke that are supposed to kind of help us get a more comprehensive view, put us in the situation as we dive into the passage here. We even did a little short survey of the first two chapters. And today we're going to build on that. We've got a few more things we want to mention, and then we're going to dig into a more broader survey here in Luke. So why don't we do a quick recap, Mike? What are some things we really should be thinking about as we continue on our study here?
Well, we want to think about who Luke was, because his identity, his background. I mean, what do you remember about Luke?
I remember that he's a Gentile,
Yes.
who was a convert, possible proselyte who went full in on Judaism. And so he had a probably good understanding of the Gentile world as well as the Jewish world.
Yep.
I remember that he was a learned man.
He was.
Knew his Greek, paid attention in Greek class.
He was in the medical field.
He was in the medical field and,
Yep.
and had a good grasp on the language.
Okay.
And really smart man.
Okay. And Luke was also, because of his education, he wrote Greek at a higher level, considerably noticeable higher level than Mark or Matthew did. So that was something important too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you remember was the religious condition, the milieu? Did I say that right? Milieu.
Milieu of the time.
The religious milieu.
Yeah. I remember you mentioned the kind of big four there, the Sadducees. You had the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Pharisees.
Yep.
At the time.
And ultimately the Pharisees won out over all the others.
And so there became this really rabbinical teaching and became very focused in I'm blanking on the word right now, where they would meet, synagogue teachings of the time period.
Yep.
So.
And they were what was most important to them were three main areas. There was the synagogue, the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath. There was circumcision, and there were food laws, keeping ceremonial cleanliness. And that really came from a sense of you had the cleanliness laws of the priests at the temple, but the Pharisees took that and they put that into regular life. That the average person, you weren't a priest in the temple, the average person needed to maintain spiritual cleanness before God by keeping important laws, avoiding contact with things that made you unclean.
Okay. Yeah.
And not only food, but also illness, deformity, Gentiles themselves. So things like that were important to the Pharisees.
I mean, that sounds like something that would really affect every day, every moment of your life.
Right, right. But because that's where they were coming from, and yet the Gentile world, although they were religious, they had a funny way to us of expressing their religion, very debaucherous in some ways, very immoral, drunkenness, immorality, and they certainly ate things that were not kosher. So the Jews and the Gentiles really maintained distance, even when you were out of Palestine in the Gentile world, which Palestine was the Gentile world.
Yeah.
Even in that time. There was a separation there.
You have like the Decapolis that was a little bit more Greek and Roman, and then the rest of the Jewish kind of
Absolutely.
world.
You can tell by the name.
Yeah.
Those names are Greek Roman names. Yeah, you can see that. Caesarea, named after Caesar. That's a good example. But what did the Christians do? The Christians come and they start by their Jew-Gentile makeup, start forming a bridge between those two worlds. But with that bridge, there's tension. And tension among people and tension within the church.
Yeah.
And Luke's writing in a way to try to address that tension, to say this is how Jesus felt about this.
Yeah.
And that's what's most important to see.
Yeah. So when we're really thinking about Jesus coming on the scene, he's coming in a time of pretty tense political and religious and social interactions going on.
Yep. And I think it's important today. What I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of lay out a step back and get a historical timeline of the nation of Israel and where it led up to today, or to the day of Luke when he's writing. And that means more than just the time of Jesus, but beyond the time of Jesus for a couple years. So I was thinking about in chapter 2, verse 1. This is a verse we've heard a lot. We read it frequently. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. And of course, this is the beginning of the birth narrative of Jesus.
Yeah.
But Luke puts it in a context of what's going on politically in the Roman world. And but from this, we're able to really get a good sense of when Jesus was born. We can get it down pretty close to the year. There's a couple years coming, give or take, but pretty close to the year that Jesus was born, and based on the political offices that Luke speaks of. And he certainly was a historian. And he does this in such a way that when we get to the book of Acts, we can tell the exact year that Paul was in the city of Corinth.
Wow.
Because he makes a reference to the proconsul that was in Corinth that year. And we can look at that. And from that, we're able to date pretty close the whole timing of the book of Acts in the first century.
Wow.
Because of the historical facts like this that Luke gives.
Yeah. Wow, that was pretty amazing. Thankfully, we had Luke who had that on his mind, that we can have that kind of information, which is pretty neat.
Yep. So what I want us to do is I want us to step back historically now, and I want us to think about if you were living in Palestine, why were things the way they were then? When Luke comes along, why were they? Where'd that all come from? And when we looked at the book of, particularly the book of Matthew, when we did kind of our midweek study, we looked at the time between the New Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, and so I want to go over and look at that again to get this in historical context. Probably the most important year in history of Israel, when you go back during that time, was in 586 when the Babylonians came in and they destroyed Jerusalem.
Wow.
That was the destruction of the temple. That was the place where God lived and God dwelled, and that made them God's people, and now that temple is gone. I want to step back again from that point and ask, what's going on with the Babylonians? What's going along before that with the Assyrians? What's going along with the Persians and all that? When you look at the map of the Middle East, you see that Palestine is located at a very crossroads location, a geographical crossroads. And someone has said, I heard not too long ago, that God chose to put his people at the center of the world. And in a lot of ways, he really did. I mean, Israel was right there. And what made it the center of the world? Well, it was the crossroads of traffic for commerce and to be able to move armies. So that's why you see in that part of the history, with Israel in the middle of it, you see this constant conflict that involved Egypt to the south. And then you have Assyria to the north. And you have battles taking place between those two great powers right near Palestine. You have Assyria coming through and occupying that land. Then you have Babylon coming through and occupying that land. It was crucial. It's crucial land. So the temple is destroyed. The people go into exile. About 70 years later, they come back and they rebuild the temple. And this is whenever people talk about the Second Temple period, it's from this period on until the Christian period that we're talking about in the nation of Israel. And what was important after that was, after a couple hundred years, and there was obviously a lot of things going on during that time, but the next major world event was Alexander the Great. Comes through in about 325 BC, and he conquers the known world. He comes in from Macedonia to Greece, into Asia, down through that area of the Middle East, all the way to the borders of India. And he occupies that in a very short amount of time, about 10 years, he conquers what's known as the world. So amazing military conquest on the part of Alexander. But he dies at a very young age. And then his empire is broken up into four generals that take over different parts of his empire. The two that most concern us with it was the one general up in Asia and the other general down in Egypt, which was Selucid and Ptolemy. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing both of those words, but close enough. Those two build their own kingdoms over the next centuries. So much so that there's kind of back and forth, and right between them is Palestine. So you have the Ptolemies in control, and then the Seleucids push them out. And it's during the time of one of those struggles that a rebellion arises in Jerusalem, because they think that the head of the Seleucids, Antiochus IV, they think he's defeated and killed in battle, so they bring up a rebellion. Well, Antiochus IV is not dead. He comes back into Jerusalem. He says, okay, I'm going to take care of these people, and I'm going to squelch this rebellion. And that it was at that point that they come in. He comes in, and he slaughters a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. Ticked off the Jews.
Everybody.
You can imagine. They were ticked off. It was from that time that the Maccabean Revolt pulled up.
Yeah.
And they raise up. And from that revolt that ultimately is successful, because there's something else going on at the time. With this going on, over to the west, the Romans have taken over the sea lanes. And they come in and they say, we're gonna usurp our authority in this area. We don't like, they send Antiochus back to the north, and they say, we're going to allow these local boys, the Hasmoneans that came from the Maccabees, we're going to let them to be king of their own land now. So for about 100 years or so, the Hasmoneans are kings. This is the first time, think about this, think about the significance of this. This king comes from the lineage of the priests. So for the first time, you have a priest and a king leading the Jews. That's why in the future the Jews are looking forward to a priest and a king coming. Think about that in the teachings of Jesus. But the Hasmoneans, they're in control there for a while. Then they start warring with each other, and the Romans come in and say, that's it. We're going to occupy this land for good. And they take over shortly before the time of Jesus. And that's why when you get to the time of Jesus, you have a Greek-speaking world because of Alexander the Great. You've got this independent spirit, revolts, trying to kick up all over the place, but the Romans are in control. That's why you read about Caesar Augustus being in control when Jesus is born. And that was about 63 BC when the Romans first came in. Jesus is born about 6 BC. That sounds strange, but they miscalculated the calendar. So about 6 BC. And the reason we know that is Herod died in 4 BC. So Herod had to be alive when Jesus was born. So Herod, now who's Herod? Herod is the guy that the Romans said, we will put a Jew, quote unquote, because Herod was half Jewish, but he had a lot of money, very, very wealthy man. He had a lot of money. So they said, we'll put him as our representative. So you begin during that time of the Romans, the line of the Herods, Herod's family. All right? Are you with me?
I'm with you.
Still with me?
Loving it.
But that's why when you get to Jesus' birth, you have Herod killing the babies. That's why later on there's another Herod that stands up and then drops dead in the book of Acts. Another person or a group of people from Herod's line, Agrippa's, they're from that family as well. So you have the Herod family all around. And you have people that were loyal to the Herods. They were called the Herodians. We've heard of those. But Jesus is born in 6 BC. He preaches for about he starts preaching at about the age of 30 for about 3 years. So around 30, we say AD, that's Latin for Year of Our Lord. I think you'll see in history books now it's CE, Christian era. So about 30 CE is when Jesus is crucified. Jesus is crucified. He's raised from the dead. We believe. The early Christians believe. That's what they wrote about. That's what they talked about. Something dramatic happened because this dead little movement suddenly explodes.
Yeah.
What happens within about the first 3 years, we have a couple very significant events takes place. So about 33, Stephen is martyred. First martyr. By the way, what kind of name is Stephen?
Stephen sounds like a Greek name.
It's a Greek name,
Yeah.
Stephanos.
Yeah.
So one of the, where'd that come from? Oh, they appointed the ministers in the church were Greek-speaking Jews taking care of the Greek. What was wrong with the widows in Jerusalem?
They were being left out, forgotten.
From what?
From eating, like being served. Like,
They
right?
weren't being,
Yeah,
their
weren't being
food,
served,
their
yeah.
food needs were not
Yeah.
being, we got food and we got an issue between the Jews and the Greek
Yeah,
Christians.
and the apostles couldn't
And the
wait on
apostles, and they
table.
so
Yeah.
that we got that food issue kicking
Yeah.
up right away. Did you ever notice that? And but Stephen's one of those. He becomes the first martyr, and then within a short time, one of the guys that was at Stephen's execution was who?
Paul.
Saul. You have Paul's conversion. Saul, who becomes Paul. Hebrew name takes on a Greek name, becomes and he becomes a Christian. And he starts his movement as a leader. So he moves through in the missionary journeys. In the first book that we see of the New Testament, the first writings from the New Testament was not one of the Gospels. The Gospels are written a long time later. The writings of Paul, Thessalonians, First Thessalonians, or Galatians. I've heard both. You hear one, and they're certain it was First Thessalonians. You hear another, you're certain it was Galatians. One of those was the first letters. So the earliest writings in the New Testament are writings from Paul. That's about the end of the 40s, almost 50. Then some significant things happen after that. In 49, the year 49, there's a riot in Rome that one of the historians who was under the Emperor Claudius says was caused by a leader of the Jews named Chrestus. So what happened? Evidently, because of the Christians and the Jews that were a lot of Jewish Christians, there's a riot there.
Wow.
About Jesus, who's gone now. So Claudius goes, that's it. And he kicks all the Jews, Christians included, out of Rome. Why does he kick the Christians out? Because as far as they're concerned, they're Jews.
They're still Jews, yeah.
They're still Jews. Remember that. Remember that. That the Christians are seen as part of Judaism. Now we know there's a reference in Paul's writings and in Acts where Aquila and Priscilla are sent from Rome and they come to Ephesus, I believe it is, because of that very thing. Now they end up going back there. But in 49 we see that riot, but we're seeing how the Roman government is looking at the Christian religion. Then in 62, in 50, we don't want to forget this one, about 50, the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15 takes place. What's that issue about? Jew-Gentile issues. What's going on?
Circumcision?
It's about circumcision, but about eating and things like that. And I'll let you get into, you can go read that and see what the final decisions are, but James is the leader there, and he stands up in behalf of the Jerusalem church. But just a couple years later, or actually about 10 years later, James himself is martyred. So in 62, about 10 years later, James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, is killed. And then in 64, Nero's now the emperor. He tries to pull off some shady real estate deal in Rome. It doesn't work, so he tries to burn down a bunch of buildings and things in part of Rome. And who does he blame?
The Christians.
He blames the Christians. And he initiates a persecution toward Christianity. And it's during that time, about 64, 65, that Peter and Paul are martyred. So you've got James, the leader in Jerusalem, killed, Peter killed, Paul killed, and then right after that, you have a revolt in Galilee among the Zealots. And they go in and they start occupying Jerusalem. The Romans come in. That's in 66. In 70, they wipe out Jerusalem. So now Jerusalem is taken care of. It's also during that time that Christians are still there in Jerusalem. But Jesus had warned them, when you see the abomination of desolation, or the surrounding of the armies, Luke says, around the city, and you get a chance, get out. Mm-hmm. The Romans pulled back for a short time to let people get out, and the Christians all left. Mm-hmm. Then the Romans come in, and that's why the Christians weren't pretty much, they were not part of that destruction of Jerusalem, because they got out of there. Then, after that point, you start to see the writings of the Gospels. Mark writes probably before the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew writes shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem. Luke writes shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem. And then John writes probably around the year 100. Mm-hmm. One more important thing is going on during this time. And that is, because the Jewish hierarchy, the Jewish leadership has been destroyed on the part of the Sadducees and the Zealots, the Pharisees have now congregated away from Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And they have become the prominent and pretty much the exclusive form of Judaism and Jewish leadership that becomes Rabbinic Judaism. Mm-hmm. That really we can see and we can trace back through the Middle Ages, back to this period of time. And they have a council in 98, the year 98. And it's called the Council of Jamnia. And there's two important decisions that come out of that council. Number one, they start zeroing in on the true Hebrew scripture canon. Mm-hmm. Which books belong and which books don't. They decided that if there was not Hebrew text of scriptures, it wasn't part of the canon. Christians accepted, some of them accepted some books that were part of the canon that had Greek texts. But that's another issue. But that, by the way, that's where we get the Apocrypha. That's why the Catholic Bible has more books than others. Mm-hmm. But the most important decision the Council of Jamnia made was they produced what they called the Curse of the Heretics, where they decided we are to throw the heretics out of the synagogue. Mm. Who are the heretics?
Christians.
The Christians. Mm. This is 98. And you have Christians in the synagogue.
Yeah, it's a couple of generations of Christians.
You have at least 2 or 3 generations after Jesus, and you have Christians worshiping with Jews in the synagogue. Now, who would that be? That wouldn't be the Gentile Christians. That'd be the Jewish Christians. They've lost the center in Jerusalem, and now they're kicked out of the synagogue. But what that shows is, for a couple or 3 generations, that there were a number of Christians that were there in the synagogue trying to worship Jesus, be followers of Jesus, while keeping to the law of Moses and being good Jews. Mm-hmm. Now, that had slowly worked away. But you see a reflection in the Gospels of that growing tension between the Jewish leaders and Christians. So when you get to John, right near the time of the Council of Jamnia, John shows people have been kicked in Jesus' ministry. Remember what happens to the blind guy? Gets kicked out of the synagogue. Yeah. You see people getting kicked out of the synagogue. And you see John speaking of the Jewish leaders as the Jews. As if that we're exclusive from them now. Because historically, politically, religiously, that's what's happened over this first century. But you can see why, up until then, there's been this tension of these 2 worlds of Gentiles and Jews within the church, and trying to bring what was important to them together. So that's a picture, a brief picture of the history that's important as far as dates go. And it's shortly before that council that Luke writes his book. So what sticks out to you there?
Man, what doesn't stick out? That's a lot of great information. And I mean, stuff that you could just dig into for a long time. But I think definitely the biggest thing is the Jew Christian relationship for sure. And also the different kind of tensions going on at the time. I mean, Jerusalem was the center of a lot of conflict and a lot of big events that happened. And seeing how like all of those things play out, like you've got Jesus during that time of the Roman occupation dealing with so many different people.
Yep.
And I think that we need to have that stuff in the back of our mind as we're reading through the book of Luke. But then thinking also Luke is written later, and so he's got memories and things in his mind that he may affect his writing, you know, in a certain sense. In a way, he's kind of looking back at Jesus.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Another thing that strikes me very much is the church survived. Matter of fact, it blossomed. While all these tensions are going on, the church multiplied and grew. Now, yeah, the tone of the church changed as far as culturally. It went from a Jewish group to a Gentile group primarily, but they stayed together. They didn't divide. If nothing else, that's one great lesson for us, whatever our tensions might be in the kingdom among brothers and sisters. The way of Jesus can bring us through. The way of Jesus can show us the way to keep unity. And it certainly did in that case as well, and the church blossomed because of it. So, now, that being said, let's get to the book of Luke a little bit here. Okay, I think that's important as we continue our survey. We'd spoken earlier, and we remember that Luke used Mark as one of his sources, as Matthew did, but there were some material that Luke has in his gospel that isn't anywhere else. And I think it's very helpful to understand some of the things that Luke was very much emphasizing by looking and seeing what material is unique, what is peculiar to Luke, because no one else used it, but he did. So there must have been a very important reason he put that in. And what I wanted to do here was just think, we're not going to look at a lot of this, but we're just going to go through real quick and mention some, first of all, of events that Luke records that aren't in the other Gospels, okay? And see if we can't see a theme there in these events.
Okay.
For instance, Jesus forgives his executioners at the cross. Only Luke records that. We see that Jesus tells the thief on the cross, who was really a rebel, someone who was leading toward revolution against the Romans, he was a rebel, but Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Luke shows us that. Only Luke records Jesus healing the child of the widow at Nain. What's the importance of that? That's a Gentile area. That's a Gentile woman there. Jesus heals the crippled woman on the Sabbath. Only Luke shows us that story, where Jesus calls her a daughter of Abraham. We see that only Luke tells us the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And then again, Luke is the only one that tells us of Mary and Martha and Joanna and Susanna being women that were with Jesus. What are you seeing there? Any themes, any ideas, threads running through there?
You have people who, in that part of the world, in the Jewish part of the world, would have been a lower social status than a male Jewish guy.
Yep.
Yeah.
How many of these are women?
A lot of them are.
A lot of them are women.
Named 4 right there, and then you have the crippled woman, and you have the mother of the dead child.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So you have women being elevated, and you have other social people, social classes being elevated. Yeah. Let's also look at the list of parables that Luke records that Jesus told that are not in other Gospels.
Okay.
Listen to these. Two debtors that are forgiven. One owes a little, another owes a lot.
Yeah.
All right? The Good Samaritan. Only Luke records the Good Samaritan. The friend who comes and knocking on the door at night looking for bread, for food to be shared.
Yeah.
All right? The rich fool. Not only does Luke talk about that the poor are honored in God's sight, that those with lower social class are honored, but those that are rich, they don't get any special privilege. Matter of fact, sometimes those that are rich and high in social class, they're fools. There's the fig tree that Jesus curses. But then he says, we're going to give it a little more time. We're going to give it another year. There's the one honor, Jesus talks about honor at the banquet. Think about the number of banquet feast stories that are there in the Gospels. There's the king that goes to war. There's the king that builds a tower. There's the lost coin. The widow with the lost coin. There's a woman again. The prodigal son.
Big one.
Only Luke does the prodigal son. The dishonest manager. Luke records about the dishonest manager. The rich man and Lazarus. Let's talk about that one.
Okay.
The rich man and Lazarus. Remember that story?
I do.
So let's see if we can name or we can count the number of things that would have made Lazarus unclean, ceremonially someone to be pushed away.
Yeah.
Here he's a beggar, lying on the ground, and which would tell us that he can't walk, so he's deformed. He also has sores. You know, there's a big thing in Jewish law and Jewish tradition that if you had breaking of the skin, if you had rashes, or especially if you had discharge, oozing things, that made you really unclean. So here's Lazarus with sores that the dogs come and lick.
Yeah.
What did the Jews think about dogs?
Very fond of
very unclean.
dogs.
They didn't have dogs. They didn't. Little Fifi was not in the Jewish household there. So here's Lazarus laying out there, unclean in every way possible. And in a moment, Lazarus dies, and where does he go? He goes, it says, to the bosom of Abraham. Now, what does that mean? I didn't know, really, until I started looking at some things, the details of what that meant. The bosom of Abraham. It had to do with the way they ate banquets. And at banquets, there was very pecking order of where people sat. The top social status away from the one who was in charge, and the one closest to the owner, who was throwing the banquet, they were the most honored. And in this case, Abraham, the father of the Jews, and it says that Lazarus is in his bosom. He was the one laying back, laying his head against the chest of Abraham in the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So he's gone from total social outcast to where would a Jew want to be?
Yeah.
The most honored place.
Wow.
That's the power of that story and what Jesus is telling there. He also talks about the Pharisee and the tax collector and their prayers. So those are different parables that Jesus taught. Again, what are the themes you see there?
You see the lowly being elevated for sure. Even in the the Lazarus parable, like Lazarus is right against Abraham, and the rich man is a chasm. Like there's a chasm between it, like just showing how far away he was. And so showing that it's not the things of this world that are, we should be focused on, thinking like that's the place we need to be, or those are the people that are always lifted up. But Jesus came in with this upside down teaching of the social status, and like we're to care for the poor. And the poor, even though they may not have the status in this world, Jesus wants to elevate them.
Yeah. it makes me think, and this is what has really become challenging to me as I've been studying for Luke, is this. It's not only who does the world say has different social status, but who do we say, who do I say is different from me? And what is Jesus' solution to that? Jesus' solution is not just to say, and I think about this, not just to say, oh, be nice to them, say, hi, how you doing? Shake their hand. But Jesus says, the people that you look down upon, or you're tempted to look down upon, or they're separated from, bring them in. Bring them to your meal. Bring them to your home.
Yeah.
This is where I want to get into later on when we talk about hospitality and we talk about eating together and being together. There's power in that the solution to the world is not in politics. The solution to the world is me treating someone else not the way Jesus said hi to them, but the way Jesus loved them and embraced them and brought them and sat down and ate with them. I think that's most important.
Wow, Mike, that was a lot of great stuff. I mean, just the historical stuff that we looked at, but then just looking at all of this stuff we have to look forward to in Luke that we can just really dive into, and that I think as we go forward here, we're going to get a little bit more pointed on some things, hit a little bit more themes and topics, which I'm looking forward to. But we're going to have some time to, even after this video, discuss and maybe ask some questions that we can elaborate on a little bit. So thank you for joining us for our second part of our dive into the gospel according to Luke, and we'll see you guys next week.